Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Shred and Soul.
I'm Shred, aka Kevin Wood.
And I'm Soul, aka Wind Hughes. Today we're going to dive right into aspects of our Constitution, and today specifically the Second Amendment. And Kevin and I have a copy of the Constitution that we keep on our coffee table and pick up periodically and read, and I don't think anyone can pay attention to what's happening in the world today without knowing that the Constitution and its interpretation is up for grabs. So we thought we would start with this one and what might be a periodic check-in to some of the amendments and aspects of the Constitution. And today is the Second Amendment, which basically is the discussion of our right to bear arms, when, where, and how. And we were surprised at how many of our family and friends have never read the Constitution. So we thought it would be good to read it and look into the history, not to support one way or the other, but to just look at what the reality of the history and the law is. So the Second Amendment, and this is what we have the right to. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward.
But is it?
No.
No.
Surprisingly, no. Do you want to go over maybe some of the history and dates?
Yeah, well,
this was a surprise.
It finds its origin in the 1689 English Bill of Rights. In the early days, the government was cracking down on Protestants, and so what we had was a situation where the local people needed to protect themselves, and so this is a cultural thing that when our founding fathers created our country, they wanted the same kind of protection, and so. When you notice the Second Amendment, how it's worded, well-regulated militia, it comes first. And what we're talking about in a militia is a group of people who form a military organization within a state, and they are basically the caretakers of the sovereignty of that state and its people. The militia part of it, I think, is what a lot of people don't fully understand as being a stopgap in a government overreach. I don't know how much that applies today, though.
Well, and I think the reality is that, back in this, if we look at the history of that time, we had 9 states. We were just in a revolution with England, right? And we just were separating ourselves for independence from a state that ruled, a federal governance that ruled our country. So we were in a battle for our independence and our freedoms, only 9 states. And it was very important for each state to have a militia that was an independent, as you said, militia, but was also subject to be called for the federal government. And it was created by the local people, armed usually by the local people, and trained by the local people.
And the idea was that these militias would form an alliance in case they were called up to defend the federal government or to defend our country.
Yeah.
And that was the idea, that there would be a lot of support for that, those individual militias, and they would be called up in the case of a national emergency. And so that's how the whole thing came about, as being a part of our militia. And what they were after basically was keeping the federal military small, and the state militias would then band together if they were needed, as far as being our federal military.
Well, they wanted the federal, and this is stuff that I learned a lot of in researching this. I'd studied it in school and read actually an amazing book that we have here and have been reading to kind of get up to snuff on this too, called the Federalist Papers. And this is a group of exchanges in letter form with Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, discussing the Constitution, creating the Constitution, and discussing the difference between a union versus a federalist organization. And one meaning that, the Federalists wanted us to have elections and each state to have a certain amount of power and not have the federal government run everything, and that there was some sovereignty to the states, whereas the union leaned towards a union where the federal government would have more power. And so they were discussing this and arguing this, an intellectual debate in the Federalist Papers, which is fascinating to read. And one of the things I read, which I didn't really understand quite well, was that in 1776, they presented what their first version of the Second Amendment based on the English Bill of Rights from 1689. And the first writing in 1776 was from a draft, and I believe James Madison proposed this, read like this: "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. A well-armed and well-regulated militia being the best security of a free country. But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person." So basically, they were specifically saying the right of the people to keep and bear arms. And for the next, basically, about 13, 15, how many years? In 1789, the argument was completed, the debate was over, and what actually was entered and became the official stance of the Second Amendment is this version: "A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, being the best security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And then it goes on.
Yeah.
So basically, the balance tipped from the people to the militia.
And the religiously scrupulous people clause was taken out. And that's now covered in probably the Bill of Rights. I don't know. But you
It's confusing.
Yeah, it's confusing.
Yeah.
But, like many things, our Constitution is a living document and subject to interpretation as we go along.
And wasn't that religious clause have something to do with conscientious objector, or am I wrong here?
Well, yeah, it's the same thing. A conscientious objector could be a religiously scrupulous person
Yes,
who
and had the right to not bear arms and not be called up to fight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was taken out because I think that there was debate as to whether you could pay somebody to take your place. And once you have a situation where you could pay somebody to take your place in a militia, then you could have any number of I don't know, ways to cheat the system.
And buy yourself
out.
The poor go to war and the rich buy themselves out. Same as it ever was.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I said, a living document.
Well, you're much better at a lot of the historical stuff because history is one of your passions. But I'm looking at this, and the battle has always been, again, between the state control and the federal control. And when I look at this, to put it in perspective recently, when I think of there were 9 states, they had just been at war with a federal government that was oppressive. They just won their freedom, so they were very concerned at maintaining state freedom and individual freedom. And so here we are, 9 states, muskets, rifles, things like that. There's nothing in here that talks about very much, though it is mentioned in occasional place in the Constitution and in the amendments, international conflict. The majority of the phrasing and the wording is about tyranny and pretty much domestic threatening of democracy.
Well, the militia, it states that a militia is necessary for invasion or insurrection.
Yes.
An invasion, of course, would be from a foreign country, foreign source.
Or potentially somebody at your front door. Mm-hmm. We talk about home invasions. I thought of that when I was saying, okay, it says invasion. And I know one of the arguments has been that the enemy or the threat can be at our front door, and we have the right to protect ourselves from a home invasion. The word invasion is the word repeatedly appearing in the Constitution and pertaining to the Second Amendment, right? So how do you interpret invasion? Is that on the borders of our country? Where's the border? Is it the border of our front door? For me, I'd like to think I have the right to defend myself if someone's at my front door about to do harm. I don't know. And these are all questions that are argued right now amongst us. And what does it mean? But they were argued in court as well. Do you remember? We had the first court case in the Supreme Court in 2008. And that was the...
Well, that actually was to give, the individual's right. It established the Second Amendment that protects the individual's right to possess firearms for lawful purposes.
So this is 2008. Is this the first time it was actually challenged in the Supreme Court? I wonder.
Yeah, I wonder too.
Because these couple of cases come up as the main challenges, and it basically said it was the District of Columbia versus Heller. You can look this up. I suggest you do. Established that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, including self-defense outside of militia service. And that was a controversial debate.
Because a lot of people think that the right to bear arms is not necessarily a universal privilege, but should only be limited to militia. But when you look at militias, those are regulated. And,
they're illegal now.
Well, they are legal within the confines of particular states and their policies.
But they're legal only basically for social service in times of disaster. If you look at, where do I have that? That it's not for military purposes or defense. It's kind of like the National Guard these days. And it's illegal to have a militia, in a sense, that's armed and prepared to fight.
It's illegal to form a private militia.
Yeah.
You can form a militia can be formed through a state.
By the government.
By the government, the state government.
Yeah.
And that militia can be any number of things. It could be an armed militia. It could be used for emergencies or whatever.
Well, there's one in California where we live, right? I think, what did you say? There were 900 people in it?
Yeah.
And it's used only for emergencies. It's not an armed militia.
But they could be called up for other things too.
They could be called up. So I think of it like the National Guard in some way, but on a state level. And only 20 states, I think, we found out, actually have.
I think it was
militias.
29.
29?
Yeah. But I think that a militia, to be able to be in a militia, you need the permission of the state. And so does that take away your right to form a militia?
Absolutely. It is illegal in every state to form a militia in the act of protection. The citizens cannot form a militia. So when you look at the Constitution, which is based on the state's right to form a militia, though it was accountable on some level to the federal government at the time, the Federation, a lot of this doesn't apply to the current world. It just doesn't. Our main enemy isn't necessarily, coming to the state line.
Yeah,
It might be at our national border.
We don't have to contend with only federal government overreach, but we have state government overreach as well that we have no ability to defend ourselves.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things, is the right to defend ourselves individually, not just from tyranny, but also from threat, personal threat, and threats to our families. But one of the things I think of is, you think of the founding fathers who went musket to musket or cannon to cannon if there was a rogue government. If tyranny was basically at hand, meaning our government no longer was protecting our rights to the pursuit of happiness and our protections under democratic law, under the federal law. So we have a rogue government. I think of how we're not musket to musket anymore. We're drone and energy weapons and, evolved weaponry up against a pistol or a rifle, or maybe someone has a semi-automatic weapon in their home. Not many, but some do. And I think of the days where the thought that a people could rise up, because it is in the Constitution and in the Declaration of Independence, that if a government no longer supports the law, the federal law, and people's right for the pursuit of happiness, then it is a duty of the people to rise up. And just the concept of that seems so foreign today when you think of the law and the powers of our federal government. But back in the day, when there were 9 states and this was created, it was a very different world. So do we change the Constitution? Do we apply it to the current world? How do we? What does it mean?
Well, the Constitution is enshrined, and it is part of the identity of our government, and we are a constitutional republic, and that means that this piece of paper, being living and constantly interpreted, is an integral part of what we are as an identity, as a nation. So there's no getting around it. We're going to have to live with it and define these things as we go along. And, things do change. But I think that one of the fundamental ideas, basically, of the Second Amendment is to be able to protect yourself with a weapon.
Well, one of the things we had, okay. So here's a statistic, and I'm giving you this statistic in terms of, do we change our Constitution and our individual right to defend ourselves at our home, in our communities, and as a nation, as citizens, not the federal army, because the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence were all created on the premise that the federal army and federal government should be as small as possible, which is the exact opposite of what we have today.
Exactly.
So everything's upside down. So you look at, in 2023, there were 46,728 gun deaths in the U.S. 58% of them were suicides. That was a startling number to read, which means 38% of that number were actual homicides and murders. And that number is 17,927. So we are actually, and that's a big number, it should be 0. But because of 17,927 gun deaths, we are looking at rewriting the Constitution and taking our right to bear arms away. These are being posed as questions. Not opinions, but questions, because when you dig in, it's a very complex question.
Well, guns are dangerous, and they're very, it's very cut and dry. If you use one, you're going to harm whatever you're pointing it at. So you can look at the rise of automobile transportation. I remember hearing statistics that every year there were 250,000 people killed on the road.
More than 17,000.
Yeah, but they're not intentionally killed, and
but it's dangerous.
It's dangerous.
It's dangerous. We're not outlawing them. There were more domestic violent deaths in the country against family members by men. We're not outlawing men. I mean, when does the number become significant? What is our population in the U.S.?
Well, 350 million.
Million? Okay, so 17,000 out of 350 million. How do you weigh the right of the 300 and how many million to protect themselves at home against 17,000? I don't know. When does the number tip? When do we look at these things realistically? How do we maintain a constitution that was based at a time when there were 9 states and muskets, and the states were required to protect themselves against a federal tyranny or an external international tyranny, which wasn't very common back in that day. It doesn't apply quite in the same way today, but yet the premise is absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
Well, yeah, it gives us freedoms that other citizens in other countries do not have.
Yeah.
And with that freedom, I think there's a cost. You quote these statistics for deaths and suicides. there's nobody telling you that you must create or must commit crimes, or you must murder people, or you must commit suicide. I think, of course, if weapons didn't exist, there would be other methods of doing just those same things. I don't know. It is a living, breathing document, and subject to interpretation. And I think that's where people they want to put their heels into the ground as far as like their stance on this, because there could be a time when any number of these amendments to our Constitution could change with interpretation.
Yeah. And before we end, I just want to, and this is something maybe we can look at going forward with other amendments about the Constitution, because I find our Constitution a fascinating philosophical manuscript, attempting to create a world based on freedoms and protecting that, which in today's world looks very, very different. But just the concept of, and again, which is debated in the Federalist Papers beautifully, the concept of federal control and keeping the federal government small, which is what our Constitution is based on, farthest from the truth of what we have right now. But state control versus federal control, which is up for debate now with the change in the administration, which is much more supportive of state control and less federal oversight. So it's a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, and as far as protecting yourself against tyranny, federal tyranny, state tyranny is still the same tyranny, and we are still not able to fully protect ourselves from either, regardless of the Second Amendment.
Okay, maybe that's a good place to stop.
I guess so.
Because we could go down this rabbit hole forever. And
Yeah.
So I suggest you get a copy. I love this copy. It's the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution. Got this one on Amazon. And the Federalist Papers comes in a bunch of different forms. I said I first read it in college, and it's written sort of in the English of the day, but it's a philosophical debate that is fascinating. So the Federalist Papers, again, it's conversations between Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, three of our founding fathers, about the powers of the federal government versus powers of the state, and the creation of the Constitution. So there you go.
I know, we just scratched the tip of the iceberg as far as this goes. This is something that we're going to be talking about. I mean, maybe not us.
I'd like to talk about it again. I'm fascinated by this.
It is very fascinating. I would be more than happy to bring this up again in one of our shows. And
I'd love to talk about freedom of speech.
Yeah, freedom of speech. It all folds into the same freedoms that we need.
We want to protect, but what does that mean?
Yeah,
maybe that's the next one we can do. Okay.
Maybe so.
Subscribe, check us out, help us go forward. We enjoy meeting with you this way. It's awesome.
Yeah, we're happy to have you on board, and please subscribe and comment.
I'd love
tell
to
your
hear
friends to tune in. And
see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.